Good morning, Mr. Gandhi.
Hello, hello. So nice to see you. Very nice to see you. Am I audible enough, Arun?
Yes, very much. Very glad to have you with
Good.
us.
I'm so happy to see you. It's been wonderful talking to you. Thank you
Likewise.
for this opportunity.
Sure. We'll just give another few minutes, Mr. Gandhi, before we get
Go
started.
ahead and take your time. Take your time. I'm glad to be connected properly. And yesterday, a gentleman came with some pictures and a statement about a donation to children in the Kanchipuram sector. So I
Yes.
signed the picture. It's a very tender and touching gesture. Thank you for it.
Sure.
It's a hot and humid day in Chennai, Arun. It's slightly
Yes.
overcast. Maybe a little drizzle during the course of our conversation.
I think rain is something that Chennai can definitely get the good use of. Another 2 minutes, Mr. Gandhi.
No, take your time. I'm at your disposal. It's nice to have a sense of our conversation through the discussion points that you have sent. It's also nice to have something unrehearsed and something unstructured, so it is natural as it should be.
So it's going to be okay for me to put you on the spot? Bhavani, are we okay? Okay, so go ahead and start. Vanakkam, friends. This is ARRM Arun. I'm the president of the Southern India Chamber of Commerce and Industry, SICCI. On behalf of SICCI, I take great pleasure in welcoming our esteemed guest for today, Mr. Gopalkrishna Gandhi, as well as each one of you, our audience, for having joined us. We appreciate your presence with us. Let me take this opportunity to wish you all a very good morning.
Thank you, thank you.
As some of you would be aware, SICCI has just completed 110 years of service to industry, government, and society. During these years, we have conducted several programs and have invited several eminent guests to our various programs. Invariably, our guests perhaps address us for about 20 to 25 minutes and limit their addresses to just the area of expertise. We, however, felt that our guests have much more to offer than just their area of expertise. We felt that our guests, as well as, and importantly, our stakeholders, can gain to know the path that each one of our guests have taken to reach their position of eminence, as well as their inputs for society and the next generation. That is how we came up with the concept of SICCI 360. Bhavani, can we have the presentation, please? Before I continue with my slide, I'd like to draw your attention to the names of two of our executives listed below. I request you to please take a note of them. And if any of you have trouble reconnecting during the course of this program, please feel free to give them a call and they will be glad to assist you reconnect again. As I was saying, SICCI 360 is a new foray for us, and we have been building on the experience of our seminars. We wanted to give a name that depicts a multidimensional perspective to the kind of discussion that we have during these programs. These are lively discussions that we have with eminent guests. Again, as I said, guests who are experts in their fields and share with us their all-round paths to excellence. When we look at the format of this session, for those of you joining us for the first time, we have 5 sections as part of this program. We first talk about our guests' expertise. Secondly, we talk about our guests' organization and the role within their organization. Thirdly, we talk about our guests' career path. Fourthly, we talk about our guests' inputs for the next generation. And finally, we talk about our guests' inputs for society. We certainly encourage you, the audience, to participate as well. There are 2 guidelines that we follow in this program. The first is that we want our guests to be at comfort at all points of time. And secondly, we would like to encourage you to participate by sharing your comments or feedback with us. And our SICCI 360 team will be glad to be able to moderate it and feed it back so that you can get your required inputs. Having said that, I would now like to share a few words about our guest for session 7, Mr. Gopalkrishna Gandhi. Mr. Gandhi was born in 1945. His parents were Devdas Gandhi and Lakshmi. Mr. Gandhi completed his master's in English literature at St. Stephen's College, Delhi University. He joined the IAS in 1968, has served several capacities, different capacities in Tamil Nadu. He's been Secretary to the Vice President of India during 1985 to 87, Joint Secretary to the President of India 87 to 92. He took VRS from IAS in 1992, took on the role of Minister of Culture in the High Commission of India in the UK, and was the first director of the Nehru Center during 1992. Mr. Gandhi was appointed High Commissioner of India in South Africa during 1996, and at the same time also High Commissioner of India in Lesotho. He was Secretary to President of India in 1997, appointed as High Commissioner of India in Sri Lanka in 2000, simultaneously also for Norway in 2002, rather after that in 2002, and simultaneously Ambassador of India in Iceland. Mr. Gandhi was Governor of West Bengal in 2004 and had additional charge of Bihar. He's an avid writer. He wrote the novel Refuge about plantation laborers of Indian origin in Sri Lanka. He's also written a play in English verse, Dara Shukok, on the life of Emperor Shah Jahan's eldest son. It was later translated into Hindustani, or rather, he translated into Hindustani Vikram Seth's A Suitable Boy. Mr. Gandhi is multilingual. He's very good in his Tamil, Hindi, Gujarati, and Bengali, besides, of course, English. He was the chairman of the Kalakshetra Foundation in Chennai, 2011 to 14, has also translated the Tirukkural into English. He was chairman and governing body of the Indian Institute of Advanced Study and president of its society from 2012 to 14. Mr. Gandhi is currently professor at the Ashoka University, professor of history and politics. I would like to end by a small personal note where both Mr. Gandhi as well as his wife, Mrs. Tara Gandhi, have been one of the finest couples that we have known and had the pleasure of knowing for a very long period of time. On behalf of SICCI, I would like to again extend a warm welcome to Mr. Gopalkrishna Gandhi. Mr. Gandhi, வணக்கம், எப்படி இருக்கீங்க?
Thank you, Arun. நான் நல்லா இருக்கேன். சென்னையிலேருந்து பேசுறேன். உங்களோட பேசி ரொம்ப மகிழ்ச்சி அடைகிறேன். நன்றி.
If we were to start on a lighter note before we go into the discussion, it will certainly be interesting to know how Gandhiji's son and Rajaji's daughter got together. And of course, how were you inspired by your 2 grandfathers?
Gandhiji visited Chennai or Madras, as it was then called, in 1919. And at that time, he had sent his son Devdas, my father, to learn Tamil and teach Hindi in Chennai. And when in Chennai, Devdas came to meet Rajaji, and in 1919 got to know him well. Rajaji's youngest daughter, Lakshmi, was born in 1912. And over the next few years, Devdas became a kind of adopted member of the family, Rajaji's family. And in course of time, love blossomed. Lakshmi and Devdas wanted to get married, and they had to wait a good bit of time because the parents wanted to be sure that their love was love and not a passing infatuation. And in 1933, the parents gave both of them permission to marry, and the marriage took place in Pune in the presence of both the fathers. The mother had passed on by then, but Kasturba was present. And that's how the story of the family unfolded. You asked
This
about
picture here
influence.
is of yourself with your two grandfathers.
This is a picture of me with my paternal grandfather to the left and my brothers on either side, and my sister to Gandhiji's right. And this little one by Rajaji is also me around the same time, when I was 2.5 or 3. I must say that all my life, my introduction, or the most interesting introduction of me, is that I am the grandson of my grandfathers. All that you read out, Arun, very graciously and is quite uninteresting to most people. This is what interests them. If I was not the grandson of these two, I don't think you would be interviewing me today. I don't think anybody would be looking at my writings today. So I have really all my life been known as the grandson of these two great men. A very undeserved privilege.
I'm sorry to disagree with you, Mr. Gandhi, but I have to say that the reason why we invited you is not just because of your lineage.
Thank you. That's very reassuring.
So we'll get right into the expertise section, which is the first section. What we're going to be discussing here in this section is about Mr. Gandhi's latest book, which is called Restless in Mercury. This is about Mahatma Gandhi's early life, and Mr. Gopal Gandhi has compiled this and put this together. We're going to be talking about this particular book, various parts to it. Mr. Gandhi, the first point that we would like to bring up is this new book, which offers a peep into Mahatma Gandhi's youth and experience that has helped him evolve into a leader. Do you think this book will inspire readers to follow Mahatma Gandhi's path in this modern era?
Gandhiji's life is an unending source of inspiration. I can speak for myself. I found it inspiring at every turn in my life. Why is it so? For two reasons. One is that he was a man of conscience, and the human conscience is an extremely compelling force. Anybody who is a person of conscience, who has a sense of right and wrong, is a person of tremendous power. He had that power. He knew his own sense of right and wrong. We may not have the same sense, but he had it. And the second was he lived in the present moment. He had a sense of truth. He had a natural instinct for nonviolence and ahimsa. He had a strong sense of what can be called dharma. But basically, he lived in the present moment. And I think we are today living in many multiple crises in this present moment. And so his life, the life of a man who knew right and wrong and who responded instinctively, like Mercury jumping in the meters, he has today many things to say to us which are compelling, which are urgent and inspiring.
You said that you did not want Gandhiji, quote, being lost in the saintly hagiographic depiction of the man as a perfect human being, but showing him as the son of Karamchand, unquote. Don't you think Gandhiji deserves that saintly depiction?
He certainly deserves it. He called his his mother a saintly person. He never used that phrase for himself, of course. It would have been atrocious if he had used that phrase for himself. But he had a sense of the importance of saintly figures in India's history, in world history. And he looked upon his mother as a saintly person, and his father, whose picture we are just seeing, as a person also of great conscience. Karamchand Gandhi was Diwan in three princely states in Gujarat: Porbandar, Rajkot, and Wankaner. Long spells of time as Diwan. And young Mohandas observed his father being thoroughly loyal to his princely rulers, to his princely masters, and at the same time very uncomfortable with the presence of the British Raj overarching these princely states. We should remember that the Indian mutiny was only 12 years before Gandhi's birth. And the mutiny, with all the humiliation that the suppression of the mutiny had brought about to princely India particularly, was very fresh in Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi's father, Karamchand Gandhi. And Gandhi, the young Mohandas, saw his father as a person who was devoted to India in the shape of his princely inheritance, in the shape of the legacy that he was serving in Porbandar, Rajkot, and Wankaner, but very uncomfortable with the presence of the Raj. So his Mohandas Gandhi's sense of India's greatness has to unshackle itself from the Raj started to see Karamchand Gandhi.
Gandhi was called Bhai in South Africa, but it was there that he was also beaten up by several sections of the South African society. Is it because of the way in which Gandhi handled these incidents that people misunderstood him?
Gandhi was very happy to be called Bhai, which means brother in Hindi, in South Africa by his Indian compatriots. There were many Indians in South Africa at that time. I am speaking from Chennai, and it is from the port city of Chennai, Madras, that hundreds of plantation and mining labor went to South Africa. They were Tamil, Telugu speaking. There were also merchants from Gujarat, Memons and Boras, and there were people from other parts of India also. They all looked upon Mohandas Gandhi, who was a barrister, who had come to South Africa after having got his legal spurs in England, to fight a particular case. But he went beyond that to take on the responsibility for advocating the political rights of the Indian South Africans, the rights which were going to be denied in terms of the denial of franchise and also many other civic communities. This was resented by the white establishment, and he was physically beaten up once, almost left to die by a group of white youth. Now, he did not prosecute any of them. Even then, he had a sense of non-violence. He said, I do not want to prosecute. He took the blows. He was also going to have to face physical assaults on him by other communities, by his own Indian community and by the African community. But these were isolated incidents. He held nobody responsible for these assaults and held absolutely no grievance in his heart against them. He was Bhai for the Indians. And he said that word sounded so sweet to my ears. He never liked being called Mahatma. He discouraged that description. But Bhai he loved. Brother he was to every single person he came in contact with in South Africa. It was a bond of love, also responsibility. But at some point, Arun, when you let me do so, I want to read out a very small part of what made him Bhai, what made him so close to the people, and what made him so relevant to the present moment in South Africa, which is also very real to us in the world today.
For the benefit of our audience, we will be having 3 sessions of a reading of Mr. Gandhi's book. that he will be doing himself. And the first one is going to be held just after we finish the first section. And before I go to my next point, I'd like to recognize the presence of the Consul General of Korea, Mr. Young Kwon, who has joined us for today's program. Mr. Gandhi, Gandhiji described himself as, quote, a good boy, unquote. Could you share with us the enormity of Gandhiji's characteristics encapsulated by this simple word?
You know, the word good, like the word love, is not used very often these days. We are far gone into civilization. We think good and bad, love and hate, these are nursery rhyme words, not words which should be used by educated adults. But actually, goodness, plain goodness, is a quality we recognize as soon as we see it, because it has become quite rare. Goodness is uncomplicated. If you look at his picture here, Mohandas sitting on the left, in his early teens, a good boy. And what has goodness really meant for him? I think it meant not having any malice, not having any prejudgments, not coming with suspicion into any situation or into any relationship, coming with trust. No situation is too complicated to be approached with trust. Of course, the trust can be betrayed, as this person who maybe, we are not very sure, but he may be a friend who later on betrayed him. I can't be sure if it is him, but it is likely that it is him. But this was an instance of the Gandhi's goodness and trusting nature, leading him to trust larger seams of human civilization, including his political adversaries, like Smuts in South Africa, like the many viceroys and governors he dealt with in India, like Churchill in Britain, all of them, just by saying, I'm sure there's some goodness in you to recognize the truth of my cause. Plain goodness and love characterized him.
You've quoted Gandhiji's eldest son, Mr. Harilal. Now, Gandhiji had four sons, where Harilal was the first and your father was the fourth. You've quoted that Mr. Harilal having been in awe of his father, and Gandhiji in turn also being extremely proud of Mr. Harilal. Isn't this a good family learning even in today's context?
It is a very important aspect of Gandhi's own youth. We should know that Gandhi and Kastur married at the age of 13. They were both 13 when they got married. Kastur was, in fact, a couple of months older. And Harilal was born to them when they were both 19. So the age gap between parents and son was very small. In South Africa, when Mohandas and Kasturba were joined by their family, and the struggle for the political rights of the Indian community in South Africa had led to the first satyagraha and to jail going. Gandhi went to jail. Harilal was went to jail. And Gandhi was so proud of Harilal's jail going. I must here read out something which Gandhi says. He says, he was asked, why are you sending your son to jail? Gandhi says, I replied, I have asked every Indian to take up hawking, that is selling without license as a satyagraha. I am afraid I cannot join as I am enrolled as an attorney. I therefore thought it right to advise my son to make his rounds as a hawker. I hesitate to ask others to do things I cannot do myself. I think whatever my son does at my instance can be taken to have been done by me. I want every Indian to do what Harilal has done. Harilal may have merely deferred to his father's wishes in acting in his manner. It is essential that every Indian should act on his own as Harilal did at my instance, and I wish everyone would do so. Harilal had a very tragic life later, but in South Africa, he was his father's first colleague. He was called Chota Gandhi. he spent not 100, not 200, but 577 days in South African prisons for his political activities, bettering by far his father's South African jail tally of 188 days. This is the inspiration, as Mohandas said, starting with his own family, starting with his son Harila, my eldest uncle.
In your book, you have traced the incidents that happened in South Africa that in turn shaped Gandhiji's character. If we had not been to South Africa, do you think we would have got a Mahatma? This is as much as Gandhiji himself did not like to be called as Mahatma, as mentioned by yourself today.
His life in 1948 in Delhi, shortly before he was assassinated, that he was born in India, but made in South Africa. It's a very telling phrase, born in India, but made in South Africa. And I'll just tell you why and how he was made in South Africa. Arun, friends, we are in the grip of a grim pandemic. We are talking about Gandhi. All these people were his colleagues in South Africa. They were all in the grip of an epidemic in South Africa at the time Gandhi was in South Africa. Apart from the political crisis, apart from their political rights for which they were fighting through Satyagraha, Gandhi writes that on 11 February 1904, I had to write to Dr. C. Porter, the medical officer of health in Johannesburg, regarding the shocking conditions in the Indian location. From what I hear, Gandhi wrote, mortality in the location has increased considerably, and it seems to me that if the present state of things is continued, the outbreak of some epidemic disease is merely a question of time. Friends, you will see here, look at the diversity. To the left is Mr. Dada Abdullah Sheikh. In the middle is Parsi Rustamji. To the right is Tambi Naidu, a great Tamil from Mauritius who was there in South Africa. Bottom left, Ahmad Kasaria. And bottom right, the great Tamil martyr, Valliyamma. This is the complete diversity of India. It was India in miniature in South Africa. Gandhi continues. On 18 March 1904, I received a pencil note to say that there has been a sudden outbreak of the Black Plague, and asking me to come immediately. I cycled to the site where Madanjit, his friend, had opened the lock of a vacant house and 23 patients of plague were put. Those who had witnessed the scenes at this hospital and had carefully attended to the patients crowded into the small rooms will never forget at once the ghastly and inspiring signs, ghastly because of the grim tragedy and inspiring because the event showed the ability of the community to rise to the occasion and to organize. At last, plague was declared. And then Gandhi writes, no one individual is to blame. It's very important for me to round this off by saying, Gandhi writes, the plague taught the British Indians of South Africa lessons which we trust will not be forgotten. We have a homely saying in India. That it were better for a man to lose millions than that he should lose a good name. What is true of individuals is equally true of communities. The French have a name for the artistic, the English for personal bravery, the Germans for hard-headedness, the Russians for frugality, the colonies in South Africa for gold hunger. Similarly, the Indians in South Africa have rightly or wrongly got the evil reputation of being insanitary and ignorant of the first principles of hygiene. In a letter to the Johannesburg Press, I said, I admit that the poorer of my countrymen do not observe the laws of sanitation except under supervision. Do not observe the laws of sanitation except under supervision. But I do submit that they are not the keepers of public health. They are defaulters as individuals and have suffered as such. It is the Public Health Committee which has to enforce obedience to such laws. So Gandhi was becoming Bhai. He was saying to his fellow countrymen, we have to be sanitary. We have to have a sense of hygiene. We are not responsible for public health, but we are responsible to follow hygiene. But it is the establishment, the authorities that are responsible. And it is they must ensure that we do the right thing. This message of Gandhi is so relevant today in the grim situation the world is facing because of COVID. In India today, COVID is a reality which is unbelievably dangerous, unbelievably scary. But it is also something which we should, can, and will overcome if we follow what Gandhi said to the Indians in South Africa then. We have to observe sanitation and hygiene in our lives and help the establishment to help us.
We now come to the last section of last point on the first section. We have heard about Mr. Smuts. Could you tell us about the General Smuts Gandhi Accord, which I don't think many of us are aware of?
General Smuts was a very religiously inclined person. This is a fantastic picture of him. Thank you for screening it. He was Minister of Interior in South Africa, with whom Gandhi was in constant touch on the subject of India's political rights, or the Indians' political rights. One of the main things was a certain tax called the £3 tax. It was a poll tax. It was levied on Indians in a way that was very humiliating to Indians. So Gandhi said, you can't have a poll tax levied on a community merely because they are in that community. They were disagreeing. Another was the right to move between provinces in the Union of South Africa without passes. And passes required fingerprinting. Fingerprinting, Gandhi said, was something which only criminals are required to give in India. But then when Smuts agreed to make fingerprinting voluntary and agreed to repeal the law making it compulsory if Indians volunteered to give fingerprints, Gandhi agreed. And another was very fundamental, the right to elect. He did not want Indians to elect Indians to parliament. He just wanted them to be equal citizens as British subjects to any other British subject in South Africa. His exercise, his satyagraha, was for redeeming dignity, the dignity and self-respect of the community from the very consciously lowered status which had been given to them. Smuts agreed on almost all major points, thanks to the intercession of the great Indian liberal Gokhale, and also a great Indian by adoption, C.F. Andrews, who had come to South Africa at Gokhale's instance. And the Smuts-Gandhi Agreement was signed in 1914, presaging a whole series of parleys and negotiations and partially successful and partially unsuccessful agreements which Gandhi came to with British authorities in India much later, most notably the Gandhi-Irwin Agreement, the Gandhi-Irwin Agreement of 1931, and of course, finally, the independence of India.
That brings us to the end of the first section for today's program. Mr. Gandhi, we had scheduled a 2-minute book reading before we move on to the next section. Would you like to do that now, or shall we? What would you like to do?
Yes, we would. I'd be very happy to do the readings now, because that will, in a sense, conclude our discussion around the book and then move on to other issues. Thank you, Arun.
Sure, please go ahead, Mr. Gandhi.
I would like to read about the great Indian martyr, Valliyamma, who was in South Africa at the same time as Gandhi, at the same time as Kasturba. I told you about two major demands made by the people of South Africa, Indian people of South Africa, which was about the right to move from province to province and the right to be equal with other British citizens and British subjects and not to have to pay the poll tax. A third disability was very suddenly and unexpectedly imposed on the Indian community in 1913-14 by virtue of a certain judgment which said that Indian marriages will not be recognized in the Transvaal or in the Cape province specifically unless they have been solemnized before the Cape province authorities or have been performed according to Christian rites. So the Indian community was absolutely stunned. And Kasturba asked her husband Mohandas, she said, therefore, you and I are not married. So he said, according to the law, yes, we are not. So our children are not our legitimate children. So he said, yes, according to this new judgment, our children are not our legitimate children. So she said, then let's go back to India. And I said, Kastur, listen, we have not come here to go back to India like this cowardly thing to do. You must resist this. And she said, if you're resisting it, I am resisting it. I will go to jail, said Kastur. Identically, Valliyamma did the same. Valliyamma, with many, many other women of Indian origin, broke the transboundary restriction, voted arrest, and was in jail. She was in the same prison in Maritzburg as Kasturba. They were given hard labor. And hard labor in South Africa meant hard labor. They were given laundry work. Kasturba and the other women who were arrested with her had to wash prisoners' clothes in jail. Valliyamma and his friend, I quote Gandhi, a young lady not yet in her 20s was one of those devoted Indian women who sought imprisonment in protest against the marriage law. Her sudden and unexpected demise, 2 days after her return home, holds in it all the elements of tragedy. She had died, not in jail, but 2 days after, of disease contracted in prison. Gandhi wrote, we mourn the loss of a noble daughter of India, who did her simple duty without question, and who has set an example of womanly fortitude, pride, and virtue that will, we are sure, not be lost upon the Indian community. I want to round this off by saying, coincidences in life are very difficult to understand, but we can only accept them with folded hands. Valliyamma died on the 22nd of February 1914. Kasturba was to die on the 22nd of February 1944 in another jail in India, in Pune. Both died on the same date of the same month, 30 years apart. Valliyamma and Kasturba are twinned by history.
Phenomenal, Mr. Gandhi. It absolutely coincidences. You cannot say that they happen just by themselves. everything happens with a particular purpose in mind. Thank you very much for that reading, Mr. Gandhi. Certainly appreciate it. That brings us to the end of the first section. We now move on to the second section, which is Mr. Gandhi's organization and role within that. Here we've selected a few points that we would like to bring about. Mr. Gandhi, a newspaper called you as a person who does not need to rest on his family name for the introduction, much away from what you had mentioned earlier. So can you please tell us now, how did you achieve this?
The phrase excellence is not a phrase which should be used for oneself. There are centers of excellence. In fact, I am not very happy about institutions calling themselves centers of excellence. Excellence is something, அது வேற மற்றவங்க தான் சொல்லணும். நான் ரொம்ப எக்ஸலண்டா இருக்கேன்னு நான் சொன்னா, நான் எக்ஸலன்சின்னு சொன்னா அது எப்படி இருக்கும்? மற்றவங்க your excellencyன்னு சொன்னா சொல்லணும். So I can't really say that I have achieved such and such a thing. It is for others to judge and say it. Everyone has achieved. I mean, who has not achieved something or the other? The most simple of persons is also a master of some skill, some craft, some tradition, some experience. Doors have opened and potholes have closed for me because of my surname, because of my name, because of my ancestry. I cannot deny it. But there is, I suppose, like in everybody else, something which is one's own. One thing I may say in pure passing and in jest, having lived all my life under the shadow of being a grandson, I regard my greatest achievement as being now a grandfather. I have 3 grandchildren, and they have given me the biggest promotion and appointment of my life. The title I covet. Gandhi loved being called Bhai. I love the role of grandfather. That is my first and most major achievement that you asked about, right? So let me be said, Rajaji is a strong influence on me for the reason that he was a man of veracity. That's the only word I can think of. He spoke his mind, and his mind was crystal clean. He told me once, speak as you think and write as you speak. That, he said, was the secret of his own writing. So I have failed to do that because I know my friends tell me and my children tell me that when I write something, I'm very complicated. But I've tried to follow what Rajaji has said. Speak as you think and write as you speak. And if you work this backwards, right? So speak as you think, then what about thought itself? How should you think? Very difficult to answer that. But I think one has to think egolessly, without letting oneself into the situation, detaching oneself from the situation, looking at things from the other point of view. And here, I'll just quickly round off by saying the other great influence on me has been that of the Indian political leader, Jayaprakash Narayan, who said always, look at any problem, and he was thinking of political problems, social issues, from the other person's point of view, especially from the point of view of the adversary. Look at it first from the other person's point of view, and then try to see how you react to it. So JP, Jayaprakash Narayan, and Rajaji have been the active influences on my life. Rajaji being my maternal grandfather, being almost incidental to this. Thank you very much.
Right from 1968, you have served in a whole range of key positions, with perhaps a notable childhood moving on to administration, diplomacy, to now being a professor and a writer. Among these, which would you say has been the most challenging and why?
I have been teaching undergraduates for the last 5 years or so, and this has been the most exhilarating and in many ways challenging assignment for me, because I know that I am in the presence of something that is extraordinary. So this is a picture we see of President Nelson Mandela immediately after I presented credentials to him. Nelson Mandela was president. I was the second Indian High Commissioner to South Africa. That's my daughter in between us. And that was a great opportunity to serve under him. He was called Madiba. His popular name was Madiba, which is, broadly speaking, the same as teacher or like mentor or preceptor or like guru. So teaching is a very sensitive and important position which casts a huge responsibility on a person, because you are presenting something to a mind which is ready to absorb it. So you have to be very clear and careful about what you're presenting, because it is being absorbed. And as coming from a higher position, a position of higher experience, a position of higher knowledge. And I must say here that teaching undergraduates is more difficult than teaching postgraduates. Teaching school children is even more difficult than teaching undergraduates, because the responsibility of teaching a child is a staggering responsibility. A child's mind is like dew, pure as dew, and you are bringing onto it the dust of human experience. It cannot be as pure as the dew is. So you have to be very careful about what you say. And that is why the position of grandfather is more awesome than the position of grandson.
Upon your retirement from the IAS in 1992, you became Minister of Culture in the High Commission of India in London. What exactly was your role here? Could you share that with us?
The High Commission of India had set up in London the Nehru Center to further Indo-British mutuality in academic exchange, in cultural relations, in person-to-person relations. And I was very privileged to be the director of the Nehru Center immediately after its founding. In this picture, you see Dr. L.M. Singhvi, the then High Commissioner of India. It was he who identified me for this position, and I'm very grateful to him. And this is a picture in which Prince Charles is attending a function at the High Commissioner's residence, and the Nehru Center was key to that. To the right is the British poet Kathleen Raine, and we were talking about Kathleen Raine's poetry and her interest in India, a typical scene from the Nehru Center's activities. It is continuing to this day to further those relations. And there's a strange link to what was happening in South Africa in Gandhi's times, because he wanted India and Britain to be in a role of mutual and equal partnership. Friends forever, not as subject and crown, but as partners. That is what the Nehru Center tried to do. And I was very privileged to be there for 4 years as the director of the Nehru Center.
Being a teacher yourself, I'm sure that the importance of education in any society and any country is absolutely paramount in terms of the country's progress. So when we talk about education, what do you feel is the role of private enterprise in driving higher education in our universities? What will be the position of autonomous functioning of our universities?
Thank you for that question, Arun. It's a very important question. I must say here that private colleges across the country present a very variegated picture. There are some outstanding private colleges, and there are some bogus private colleges. Some private colleges are there just to make money, and they are a disgrace to the whole concept of education. But let us go by the better examples. This is a picture of the Gujarat Vidyapith, which Gandhi set up, and of which he remained chancellor to the very end of his life. This was at a convocation. To his right is Acharya Narendra Dev, the great socialist. He had invited Narendra Dev to give the convocation address. And up front, sitting to his left up front, is Imam Bawazir, a friend of his from South African days and a satyagrahi. So some universities like the Gujarat Vidyapith, which is today a deemed university, started as a private university as an alternative to British universities under the scheme of nationalist education, is an outstanding example. We have many examples of private universities now. Oh yes, here we have the Annamalai University, extraordinary example of a private person's vision. We have Azim Premji, we have Manipal University, we have Ashoka University. These are great examples of private universities which are propelled by the vision of an extraordinary person or group of persons who want to give to India the opportunities of the best education in the world by bringing in faculty from all over the world, by giving opportunities to Indian faculty. Now, C.V. Raman, S. Radhakrishnan, they were teachers in the presidency college in Calcutta. They needed that opportunity. That's how they got where they got. So private universities, not just because they bring funds, but because they bring vision and direction, are essential in a country of our size, where government-driven universities cannot really reach everyone and cannot afford to bring the highest standards as they would like to. So a partnership between private vision and private enterprise and public investments is essential, and is not only essential, I would say, but is a desideratum, is unavoidable in India. But the importance of quality, of ensuring quality, finally really rests with the faculties and the students. A dilution of standards by faculty, of faculty, by students, of students, would be fatal to the life of our country, let alone the progress of the country. And so I would say that the distinction between public and private in the matter of university education is a fine distinction. What we are talking about is learning. What we are talking about is the spirit of acquiring not just talent, but of acquiring a vision for the place of knowledge and learning in our society.
We now have a question for you, Mr. Gandhi, from a student, Miss Ananya. She's a first-year student of biotechnology at Sri Venkateshwara College of Engineering. Ananya, if you're online, please go ahead with your question.
Hello,
Ananya?
sir.
Yes, please go
Hello,
ahead.
sir. Greetings, sir. I'm Ananya from first year biotech from Sri Venkateshwara College of Engineering.
Hello, Ananya. Go ahead.
Sir, I have a question for you.
Go ahead, Ananya.
Sir, in an interview, you said that the India should reconsider its economic policy as the present one encourages industrialization and urbanization, causing huge population unsettlement and forcing farmers to migrate to the cities in large numbers. How can we solve this crisis, sir?
It is not a problem that can be solved overnight by one decision, by one cabinet meeting, or by one government order. But this is something which is absolutely vital for our life. Populations in migration are rivers of distress. Why should people migrate? Because there is something that is happening to where they belong, something that is uprooting them, something that is throwing them out of their natural setting. And so, if land, which belongs to the people who live there, is going to be utilized for the setting up of industries, which it has to be if industries have to be set up, we must make sure that the people of that region are not dispossessed by that process. Industries have to come. Industries need land. But does that have to lead to the dispossession of people? Does it have to lead to people losing their livelihood and, as we saw during the pandemic, their lives? This is one question which has to be met. Just like the other question about the environment. We need energy, we need electricity. And hydroelectricity was regarded as the most natural answer to the problem of inadequate energy sources. But dams being built, large dams being built in areas of fragile, seismically volatile geology are bad news. We know that dams built on the Himalaya can cause gigantic turmoil. We did not appreciate this then, but we know it better now. The combining of human and ecological welfare. Welfare is a very deluding word. The right word is survival. The combining of human and ecological survival with development has not been priority for a developing country like India, but it has to be. For we now know that GDP, without what Bhutan calls gross happiness, and which should really be called basic survival, is a false destination.
That brings us to the end of the second section of today's event. Mr. Gandhi, we now have a recording of yours, of your book reading in London. Can we play that?
Please, it is about Gandhi's time in London as a student in London and how he grew out of that particular phase into what later became his South African phase.
Bhavani, can I request you to please go ahead?
He describes his time in London as a student with a lot of laughter at his own expense. He is obviously very fond of that city, and he was later to say that if there was any place outside India where he would be so happy to live in, it would be London. I had brought Western clothes with me, but a Bombay cut is only a Bombay cut. That would not do in English society. And so I went to the Army and Navy stores where a chimney hat to be sat on my head was bought for 19 shillings. And then on to Bond Street, no less, where the elite had their clothes tailored. There, putting a hissing matchstick on full 10 pounds, I got myself an evening suit. And as if this was not enough, I wrote to my brother to send to me a chain that would hold a pocket watch. My brother's innocent and princely nature moved to do so at once, and a heavy chain of pure gold arrived at this fop's doorstop from home.
We now go on to the third section, which is on your career path, Mr. Gandhi. You are multilingual and you've translated several works of literature. How do you overcome challenges in translation, like knowing about a variety of features, such as language structure, which differs between languages?
Translation is a very enjoyable and at the same time very challenging exercise. It is enjoyable because you have the experience of the original and the experience of converting that original into a faithful disciple of the original in your translation. And so you are moving from the parent to the child and moving from the life of the original to the equally important life of its replica. But it is very important to translate the spirit of the original apart from the word itself, because very often the spirit of the original does not lie in the word, it lies in the meaning and lies in the context of that word. One must have complete fidelity to the spirit and respect for the letter of the parent document while translating. And when one does that, then one is at peace.
We have another question from a student, Miss C. Roshni. She is doing her second year audiology and speech language pathology at SRMC. Roshni, if you're online, can I request you to please go ahead with your question?
Sir, and Roshni. I have a question to talking about sustainable development. Indian industry not investing in these domains, sir.
Roshni, I think you should repeat your question because there was a lot of breaks in between.
Okay. Is it audible?
Yes, much
Yes,
better.
it seems better.
Okay, sir. Even when the whole world is talking about sustainable development and use of appropriate technology, why the Indian industries are not investing in these domains?
I cannot speak for industry, nor can I speak for technology, but I can speak for society as a member of society. And I would say that the expectation that industry should become a philanthropist and a charitable organization is not fair, is not practical. A person invests in industry, manufacture, or in the production and distribution of services, not selfishly, but certainly with a certain interest in making a fair profit. But the test lies in drawing the line at which point profit becomes greed. When about 8 years ago, the world faced its very serious financial crisis and banks were crippled, President Obama said this is because of greed. Now, I am not judging any individual industrialist in India or elsewhere. It is not appropriate, either in this forum or otherwise, for me to do so. But we have the example of people in political power who use political power for the national good, not for their own good, but for the national good, like Sardar Patel, like Nehru, like several chief ministers, like Kamaraj in Tamil Nadu. காமராஜ் மாதிரி ஒரு தலைவர் நம்ம நினைக்கணும். காமராஜ் பதவியில இருந்தாரு. காமராஜ் கையில பொறுப்பு இருந்தது. காமராஜர் கையில பவர் இருந்தது. அது அவர் நாட்டுக்கு செஞ்சு. Likewise, economic power, the power of enterprise, is power. It has to be used powerfully. You cannot say I'm going to be an industrialist, but I'm going to leave everything to my staff, to my workers, to the board of trust. An industrialist leader cannot be a wishy-washy person. He has to be a strong person. Otherwise, his enterprise is doomed. It is deserving to be doomed. But whether it is being used for the public good or for private good, with due allowance for due profit, is the point. Society judges that. Society requires industry. Society requires industry to be at the service of the nation. This is why we have chambers of commerce. Because they want to feel and be in tune with the public, with the society in which they are situated.
Considering time, we've been curtailing some of the points that we had in specific sections, so please bear with me. We now move on to the fourth section, which is our guest inputs for the next generation. The first point here, Mr. Gandhi, is going to depict your favorite role, that of being a grandfather. You've mentioned Gandhiji's parents were the first people to positively influence him. What's your recommendation to today's parents to positively influence their children, and today's children to be positively influenced by their parents' good deeds?
Thank you for that very difficult question, Arun. One thing that I can say without any hesitation is that a child is not a fool. A child observes very carefully. Mohandas observed his parents. Harilal observed Mohandas. A grandson, a granddaughter is a very precious person, and she or he is observing the elder all the time. And what is the child seeing in the parent? A role model, yes. A loving person, yes. But a person who is not a hypocrite. That is the most important thing. A child recognizes hypocrisy in parents and in teachers like that. What the younger generation today is great at is in spotting hypocrisy. So the first thing that a parent should know is that she or he has to be true, has to ring true. To be one thing and do another is the end of confidence and trust in the parent. So whatever else you may do as a parent or not, you have to be true.
Glad to recognize the presence of Mr. N. Murali as well as Mrs. Tara Gandhi, who have also joined us today. Mr. Gandhi, India, with its long history of values, tradition, and culture, can lead the world in several spheres of knowledge. But we really aren't to the extent to which we should. Is it because we have not documented things and effectively passed them on to the next generations?
That is partly true. not wholly but partly true. But I think it is far more important to be aware of the realities of our time today and address the present moment rather than think of what we are passing on. What we pass on is going to be determined by what we are today and not by what we may strategize about passing on tomorrow. I don't think the great generation that laid the foundations, as for instance, in the newspaper, The Hindu, or in an industry like the Tatas, would have been possible if they had been obsessed about what we are going to do for the future, rather than attend to what is being done today. It is the present moment, the integrity, the honesty with which the present moment is handled that will shape the legacy that is being created for the next.
We now move on to the last section of today's event, which is your inputs for society. Ethics and values used to be taught as part of moral science in elementary schools, but not in the recent past, in the recent several years actually. These are important to inculcate among our children so that we ensure that they grow into desirable adults. This also has an impact on how our businesses are run. Why do you feel this education need has not been realized among us?
I would not say that it has not been realized. It has been realized patchy in India. You saw that photograph, the Gujarat India. It is an institution which has had its ups and downs, which is not at its 100% health even today. But then there are institutions which have done exceedingly and phenomenally well and are continuing to do so. But the foundation of all education, which is the primary school, the elementary school, is what really requires tremendous attention. And there, the parents and the teachers of those institutions, those schools, bear the greatest responsibility. I feel the examples of schools all across the country received a tremendous fillip in the Pratham movement that started. Pratham is a globally notable movement. And I feel the importance of Pratham has probably not been realized by us today and has been allowed to almost dissipate in the last few years. And this is very unfortunate. The selection of textbooks, the quality of pedagogy that lies in scenes of fundamental textbooks is of vital importance. And here I must say that moving away from tradition and from conservatism, the place of life sciences in the curriculum of early education has not been fully recognized. Life sciences need to be taught by mature and responsible teachers to students in a way in which it has not been taught in our country today. Child marriage is a factor in India. It is a factor, it has been a factor for centuries. And Gandhi's life has dealt with that in a way in which few lives have. So I feel education at that primary, essential, and foundational level needs to be protected by us and made available in a way in which an oyster holds a pearl.
Thank you, Mr. Gandhi. When there was a ban on a book, you and your older brother, Mr. Rajmohan Gandhi, opposed the ban, saying it would call into question India's claims to be the world's largest democracy. How do you feel we should sustain freedom of expression?
Banning a book is not the way mature societies and mature governments function. They reflect insecurity. I think the best response to that phenomenon of banning books came from the late leader and Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee. Atalji said famously that the answer to a bad book is not banning that book, but writing a better book. By writing a response to that book, not banning it. Is a democrat's response. It's also the response of a writer, because he was a writer himself, and a writer who had been in jail during the emergency. So he knew what draconian, arbitrary, authoritative politics means, what state power which curbs public expression means. Freedom of expression is a much talked about subject, and I'm not going to add to anything by saying more on it, except to say that freedom of expression, democratic dissent, are the finest fruits of the Indian Constitution, which is the result of a long, laborious, and glorious struggle for not only the political independence of India, but the unshackling of the mindset of subjugation and subjection.
That brings us to our last question for today, Mr. Gandhi. You did speak about COVID and its impact, and was very glad to also get to know from you that we certainly have to see the worst of it away from us as soon as we can. What do you think should be our lessons from what we have encountered over the last year and a half? What should be our lessons going forward?
We are still in the grip of the crisis. I can speak as a person who's observing what is happening. There was a lull. And many of us thought that there was something scientific about the lull. The virus turned docile and was going to probably fade away. But some of those who knew better knew that laxity and callousness are going to give us a tremendous rebound of the virus, and that is what has happened. What Gandhi described about Johannesburg in 1904, the lack of simple compliance with basic common sense of hygiene and sanitation in a situation of crisis has caused what has happened. But the responsibility for enforcing compliance rests with the authorities. And I cannot for the life of me understand why the return of the virus in the second surge, which is all of mutations and variants, but no less and perhaps more because of our own negligence, has been allowed. Our leaders have had opportunity after opportunity to lead us by example and show the way out, as Gandhi did in South Africa in Johannesburg in 1904. But that has not happened. That has not happened. We are letting down science. We are letting down health workers, front line health warriors by our callousness. How can a vaccine function if we are not going to help it to function? We are trying to mop the floor without turning the tap off. It is a collective failure of massive proportions. I do not know if there is will enough amongst us as a people or amongst our leaders to show us the hard way out.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gandhi, for joining us today. Certainly appreciate having you with us. Of course, we discussed your book earlier on in this session, and um, I think that there are a couple of more volumes that are scheduled to come out in the time to come.
There may be one volume, I think, for the remainder of his life, beginning with his return to India in 1915 up to the end of his life in 1948. But more than books on Gandhi, more than compilations of his writings, is just the force of his living example, as is seen not just by him or in him, but in countless individuals whom we are fortunate to have in our midst today, who are very simple people, simple, unacknowledged leaders of society and of opinion, who are doing so much all the time without expectation of recognition, only dedication. And amongst them, I would say, our health workers today are the heroes of our time.
Certainly, we each have to be able to appreciate the efforts of each one of our frontline workers who've been doing a phenomenal job. And we also look forward to putting the pandemic behind us so that we can move on with the necessary progress that we have to be able to make. Mr. Gandhi, let me take this opportunity to thank you again. We would like to convey our best wishes to you for your future editions of your book, as well as your future endeavors. We would, friends, as per the format of SICCI 360, we always have photographs of our guest, autographed by the guest. Because we are doing this program completely online today, we were not able to do it in person. So we had sent the photographs to Mr. Gandhi and requested his autograph. We've put it up on your screen for your reference. Mr. Gandhi, thank you very much for having this done and sending it back to us. Also, as a token of our appreciation of your joining us today, we would like to give you a memento. This is a contribution that we have made in your name to the Sri Kanchi Kamakoti Child's Trust Hospital. As some of you would be aware, this hospital is dedicated to pediatrics and it has been doing yeoman service to the underprivileged families, underprivileged children. SICCI has contributed to the Kanchi Kamakoti Child's Trust Hospital in the name of Mr. Gandhi. Mr. Gandhi, we will have this certificate sent to you at the earliest. And again, we would like to thank you very much for joining us. We certainly look forward to continuing our interactions with you in the time to come.
Thank you, Arun. It has been a privilege to participate in this conversation with you and with SICCI. And I join you in complimenting all the participants who have been present with us in this discourse. Thank you very much. Thank you, Arun.
Friends, I'd like to take this opportunity to appreciate the SICCI 360 team that has done a wonderful job in putting the SICCI 360 series together. This team is led by Mrs. Valli Arun, President of the Vellingro Group and Trustee of the Tamil SI Sangam. Professor T. Murugavel, Head of the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at SPCE, co-chairs this committee. And he is in charge of putting together the discussion points after doing a lot of research work on each one of our eminent speakers. Mr. Vinod Solomon and his effective secretariat team from SICCI. Mr. Gokul Santanam, who's Senior Vice President at Emphasis. He, along with Mr. Amalan Alavandar, who's environment consultant at the Asian Development Bank, together do the moderation of the audience queries and put them across to us for being answered. We have also Ms. Vilasni M. Arun, a student of clinical psychology, who brings in the student focus into the SICCI 360 series. Friends, I'd also like to share with you that the next SICCI 360 program is scheduled for next month. It's going to be on the 21st of May, which is Friday. Our guest is going to be Thiru A. Kaliyamurthy. Yes, as much as Mr. Kaliyamurthy has established a name for himself among the police community and has done significant service for society, what he has been known for over the last several years since his retirement is that of being an orator, motivator, and inspirator. He has spoken on several occasions in both Tamil and English, and also spoken about the importance of Tamilians recognizing Tamil and moving forth. This is going to be a very interesting discussion covering both his oratory efforts as well as his time at the police force. This, as I told you earlier, is scheduled for Friday, the 21st of May, 10:15 a.m. in the morning, just like today. It's going to be held completely online. Please mark your calendars and certainly look forward to you joining us. That brings us to an end of today's program, friends. Thank you very much. It was wonderful having you with us, and we certainly look forward to your ongoing participation with us. We would like to take this opportunity to wish each one of you safe times ahead as we negotiate this pandemic and come out of it. Nandri, Vanakkam.